I'm Dr. Anthony Harper here, blessed to be at the Values Voter Summit with Dr. Lance Wallnau. Thank you, Dr.
Good to
Wallnau,
be here.
for joining me here. And we've got a lot of crucial issues that are happening that was made very clear in the Values Voter Summit and in your presentation yesterday. Right. You talked about 7 mountains and about the things that we need to take back as Christians. I want to first address, though, the issue of that I had asked you about is the role of Israel.
Right.
And Vice President, the President have been very clear, and the support for Israel was made clear also at the Values Voter Summit, the historic advancement in the support of Israel. So what is the role of Israel in these last days?
Well, and especially interesting because I flew in from Tel Aviv this week to be here and was standing on the temple steps, on the southern temple steps, which is where Peter, we believe, preached on Pentecost. There were 2,000 people there representing 120 nations. So what you have is this moment in Israel, which is interesting. Where else in the Middle East can you go and gather 120 nations of Christians to worship in public like that? And as I stood there, I was thinking, wait a second, this is 120 years ago, the first Zionist Congress had met to declare the vision of a nation for Israel. This is the 70th year since David Ben-Gurion first launched the nation state and the United Nations voted. It's the 50th year since Jerusalem was reunified under its own sovereignty, under the Jewish people. And so you have this intersection of all these things happening right now. And the President of the United States comes along and makes this unusual decree in the 70th year that the Embassy of the United States will go from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And as that decree is made, all the nations have to go on record as to whether or not they are voting to affirm the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign nation or whether they challenge it. They have to vote for it, they have to vote against it, they have to abstain, or they have to ignore the conversation. And in that moment, you see 9 nations agree with the right of Israel to exist. What does that tell you? It tells you that Israel and its very existence is an end-time issue that touches on the right of God's agenda and God's will to become manifest on the earth.
Okay, along with this, I'm thinking of the prophet Joel, chapter 3, verse 2. A lot of people haven't been aware, but that God is angry about the idea of dividing the land of Israel. It says specifically that God enters into judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the nations that divide up his land. So my hope, and a lot of Christians' hope, is that President Trump would never entertain any giveaway of land ever again for the Israeli people, never, because it's never brought peace by conceding on that issue.
That's a fact.
And there's another issue, and that is for the role of President Trump. You'd earlier talked about him being a Cyrus figure, and I've heard this from other Israel leaders. So besides his broad, his very robust, his very courageous stand in telling the whole world that Jerusalem is the eternal capital.
My God.
What else do you see for President Trump in his role as a Cyrus figure here?
Well, the whole Cyrus thing is so to use a hippie word, is so trippy, because this guy comes along and what Cyrus did was he made a decree. And when Donald Trump was emerging, I kept thinking, my God, if there's any politician in history who's capable of an unpredictable utterance, it's this president. I mean, in midnight, he could tweet something that would shake the world up. And so I wrote down, before he was elected, Donald Trump will go down in history as a modern-day Cyrus, a Churchillian leader. So in the cast in the mold of Churchill, Cyrus as a type of leader for us Christians, we got to really get this straight. Cyrus was a non-Jew. God sent someone from the outside. Every Jew would love to have a messianic deliverer, obviously from the line of Judah, and from Bethlehem. However, God sends a Persian. So what happens is the Lord sends a deliverer from the outside in to deliver his people. Isaiah 45 says, I've raised you up, Cyrus, for this purpose, for Israel and my people's sake. So my people's sake is the Christian, Israel is Israel. But then it even says, though you have not known me. Christians have got to stop voting for people on the basis of how good they are in a Sunday school, litmus test, and start looking at how grounded are they in the principles that align with the kingdom of God. Because I'd rather have a Churchill or a Lincoln or a Trump than have a waffling born-again believer who is unreliable.
Yeah, very, very disturbing issues that have been happening, and it's great to be here to talk about the importance and the role of Christians that can make a real big difference. And I'm also thinking about that one area, you talked one of the mountains is the media. Question for me and many other Christians is, why aren't Christians more of a prominent voice at the White House? And that being the world stage, where people throughout the world are looking to hear what is concerns that people have, and why we don't have a Christian media person on the front row of the White House. When
why?
CNN is so disrespectful of Sarah Sanders and our values. So what is the role of the Christian media these days?
You know what I'd love to do? I'd love to have a meeting with the president. I have these questions myself. I'd love to get together with him and say, why are we even being polite with the establishment set up regarding media? Mm-hmm. Who says you have to take a question from CNN? My gosh, their ratings aren't that impressive. Right. So why don't we pepper some people in here that actually represent new media? I mean, like Breitbart, for instance, just emerged on the scene, like a decade ago. Andrew Breitbart, he was a Huffington Post writer before that. So he was a liberal, got converted by listening to Dennis Prager and Rush Limbaugh and stuff. Mm-hmm. So why don't we have new media like yourself? And there ought to be press passes where the questions that are coming up give the administration an opportunity to highlight and make distinctions on the things that move the country forward, rather than feed the stupid narrative that's being manipulated by the left. In my opinion, I got a radical idea. I think the media is becoming like a false prophet. Mm-hmm. They're speaking lies, and they're speaking it with such drum beats of coordinated intentionality that they're actually mesmerizing the uninformed in a kind of hypnotic propaganda state. And so we've got to have believers that are involved, that are asking questions that bring truth and clarity to the conversation.
Although without advocating for the front row seat, CNN's seat, to take that lead and give Sarah Sanders opportunity to have more positive engagement.
Yeah.
So really some serious things that need to be done. I talked with Dinesh D'Souza about this issue. Fake news. I just described in my article that the fake news sources do not support our Judeo-Christian values, and he said that's an understatement. They aren't Christian.
Right, not only do they not support, they're actually on an agenda to dismantle them.
And like in The Death of a Nation, a movie, a documentary recently, equating their tactics to the tactics of the Nazis as well. But the propaganda issue, talk about memorizing, is a very serious issue. What's happening in the media. And the fourth question I have is about President Lincoln. Now, in President Lincoln's proclamation in the middle of the Civil War, he made, there was an assessment in the proclamation that said America is a nation that has forgotten God. We've become too proud and arrogant and self-reliant. And he called for a time of national repentance and pleading for mercy from God above to have mercy on our nation. And from Psalms, he quoted that only those nations are blessed whose God is the Lord.
Imagine that. Can you imagine a president, a modern president? I don't care who. First of all, if they were a Huckabee or a Cruz, the media would have an absolute meltdown, because they'd say the guy's going all religious crazy on us, and this is what happens when you put an evangelical in office. But if Donald Trump does it, they'll say, this son of a gun, this hypocrite, how dare he, this womanizing, blah, 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 blah. But Donald Trump's the one guy that could do it. And actually, that proclamation, I've read it, I was shocked at the transparency with which Lincoln said, in suffering from the Civil War at that time, the bloodshed and the anguish of that crisis had caused, and he put his finger on it. He said, perhaps we have become so prosperous we've forgotten God. And so Lincoln, as the nation's pastor, who, by the way, didn't go into office as a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's very possible that, D'Souza's latest work is on likening Trump to Lincoln. I pray to God that, that he's delivered from getting harmed in office. But I would say Trump could be very willing to do it. And I just pray that the country doesn't get to the point where the Civil War actually took us, where we were in the crucible of our survival.
What would happen if President Trump were to defer, to tell the whole world, I've been reading President Lincoln's proclamation, and I want to defer to President Lincoln on this matter of making America great again, because his assessment is just like the state of America today.
I think it would be totally overlooked and ignored by the media, the same way that he made a very powerful statement about we're going to end this assault on Judeo-Christian values, and they'll ignore it. And if it gets any media, they'll say, well, this is a desperate man trying to change the conversation. I'll tell you what, I hate to say this. America would have to be in a crisis of sufficient national proportion that it would justify a moment when the president is actually being a man of religion and would make the statement. It would require that the country would actually take it seriously rather than perceive it as a mechanism to change the conversation.
Well, very serious issues to deal with, and once again, this is a blessing to be here. I'm Dr. Anthony Harper, Intermountain Christian News, with Dr. Lance Wallnau.
Great talking, Anthony. Get that seat on the front row, man.
Let's go for it.
All right.
Leading the way at the White House.